from the outside in. From the outside in. So I want you to think of a time when you may have felt like an outsider. Everybody got something that pops into your mind? How that felt to be an outsider. I think of a time here about 6 months ago. I was invited many times, but I finally accepted the invitation to go to Lake Geneva to gather with a group of pastors. They've been gathering for years and years and years, same group of people. And so when I went up and joined them, they were gathered together for a time of fellowship. And you would think, well, a group of pastors, that's going to be a welcoming, marvelous, warm reception. I want to say it sometimes feels like the Smith Lounge, where people are talking in their little groups, and if you're an outsider, it's hard to budge in. You know what I'm talking about? Maybe you've experienced that when you've been an outsider. You try to come in, and the people are busy. There may be some friendly nods and a hi, but really, as far as come and join us, who are you, yada, yada, yada. And in fact, when you do join a group, you discover that there's also some stories that they have been telling for a long time, and it's been a while. It's been a year since they've been together, and so they start to retell the story, and they don't finish it, and before they're done, they're all laughing, and you're standing there saying, what was so funny about that? Outsiders becoming insiders. You see, it honestly takes insiders to invite outsiders to find their way either into a building or into a group. I think yesterday we had a couple who was coming for the first time for premarital counseling. And they arrived on time. I was just a minute delayed taking care of a couple last few photocopying issues. And by the time I got up to the door here off the parking lot, which you can imagine what would be the case of the doors in the parking lot on a Saturday, they were locked. So they started going around the building trying all the doors to figure out how to get in. I'm over here now unlocking the door and waiting for them to come when I hear the doorbell back over on Grand. So I'm scooting back across to get over to finally let them into the building. Finding our way into a group when you are an outsider can be a challenging thing. In our gospel reading for today, in Mark chapter 1, verses 40 to 45, Jesus has just announced in the few verses prior to this that his purpose was to go from village to village and tell them the story of the good news. This is why I have come. Now, when Jesus says, I'm to go and tell them the good news, and if somebody asked you, what is the good news of Jesus, what would you say? Do you know how to answer that? Or do you kind of feel like a deer in headlights a little bit? You know it's about Jesus, but you're not exactly certain what that means. What is this good news that Jesus was announcing from place to place? Well, remember this, that the Gospel of Mark is not a biography of Jesus. It's not all the accounts of everything Jesus said and did. If everything that Jesus said and did were written down, it would be libraries filled with books. All we have here is 16 chapters in Mark, and by chapter 11 of Mark, it's already Holy Week. It's Palm Sunday. It's the final week of Jesus' life. So in those first 10 chapters, there's no way that they can capture all the stories of Jesus. Isn't that right? Does that make sense to you? So here you have some of the stories that Mark has gathered together that's been part of the proclamation about the good news of Jesus. So when Jesus says, it's my purpose to go and tell the good news, let me be clear about how I understand what that good news is. Number one, it is about the cross of Christ who died for us, who died for the sins of the world. Yours, mine, and for the sake of the whole world. And Jesus came, this is important, Jesus came to reconnect people, all people, to God. The same God who had made them. This God loves all people. John 3:16 is a summary of what the good news is. That God so loved the world that he sent Christ, who taught, and what he did demonstrated God's love for all people. God's love for all people who are open to be loved. This is why Jesus came. So in our gospel for today, as we move down to verse 40 to 45 of Mark chapter 1, Jesus, to be consistent then, must be teaching and doing things that are consistent with God's love for all people. So as we look at this story for today, we have a leper who comes, a man with a skin disease, a leprous disease. Such an important part of the Old Testament that they designated Leviticus chapters 13 and 14 all about leprosy, how to know what it is and how to diagnose it and what the treatment is. In fact, in many of the villages in Leviticus, it tells you that if you see that you have some kind of leprosy in your house or on your body, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to go in the village and see who? Not the doctor. You go see your priest. Where'd the priest go? She vanished. Oh, she's in the back. They'd go see Pastor Joanna and show them their ooze and their pus and their stuff. And then she'd say, well, this is what you need to do. You need to mess up your hair, disheveled hair. You're to tear your clothes. And when you meet anybody, because you're going to move out of town, you're going to go into an area where nobody lives. You're going to be isolated and alienated. And when you see somebody, you're supposed to say this. Try this out at the mall. See how popular this is when you say, unclean, unclean. You know, that's how to make friends and influence others, clearly. But this is what was going on. So this man comes up to Jesus. And it causes me to wonder on this story of unclean. What does it mean to be unclean today? We do have some people who still have leprosy within the United States, and leprosy still exists within the world, especially in places of poverty. But I wonder if leprosy is not perceived as people who have, like, say, HIV and AIDS, or somebody who, in fact, is addicted, has an addiction to alcohol or to drugs, and with that has developed a felony and now find themselves, for instance, in prison. We talk a lot these days in terms of what's being covered in the news about a broken system. And if I see a broken system at work, one of the places is certainly in our prison system. Or if you land in prison because you did some stealing because of your addiction, and you now find yourself applying to try to get some help with your addiction, not that you belong in prison for it, that's not helping with your addiction, but you apply to get into a rehabilitation program within the state of Illinois in our prison system. Do you realize because of the funding in our state, they've had to cut a lot of those programs? They reduced the number of people who can get in. So there's people sitting in our prisons who need help with their treatment and they can't get it dealt with. It'd be like being sick and ending up in the hospital and not being treated for what you went to the hospital for, and you just laid in the bed. You see, that's the insanity of the systems that serve us today. So I believe that one of those people who are perceived unclean might be when somebody comes out of prison, moves back into your neighborhood with a felony, and how do we receive them? What are the opportunities for them to have free and easy access to jobs that match with their skills? Because if we believe that addiction is an illness, then does it mean that it needs to be a stigma their whole life because of a choice that they made when they were in their 20s, that now when they find themselves 50 years old, they can't serve in other capacities? This is crazy thinking. Secondly, it could mean that we're in a wheelchair, or that we find ourselves dealing with mental or emotional disability, or that we have a different sexual identity than, quote unquote, the norm as it's perceived in our culture. You see, we mark it as unclean by the ways and the attitudes by which we welcome people, the way that we're open to them, by our looks. When you come by a person who's in a wheelchair, or somebody who is not functioning maybe at the same place that you are, and how we look or don't look at people. And thirdly, economics. There used to be the saying, everybody in America could pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right? And some of us happened to be raised into families where we had some access, and we also had some support from home, which enabled us to get to where we are today. Some of us have also caught some breaks in the midst of it, but the reality is that not everybody has equal access. Not everyone has the same access to education, nor the same ability to have access in the employment realm. Like being put into a special line in school because your family can't afford to provide for your school lunch, so you go into a special line. Now, what does that say, friends? This is where there is that same kind of stigma that was there for the lepers in Jesus' day. But not only did Jesus stop and pay attention to the man who had leprosy, but secondly, he engaged with the man in conversation. And he said to Jesus, if you choose, you can make me clean. And Jesus said, I do choose, be made clean. And then what did he do? What did Jesus do next? He touched the man. Now, according to Leviticus, if you touch a man who has leprosy, even though you've said he is clean and he's not shown himself to the priest, that makes you as good as having leprosy. In other words, you're now unclean by touching someone who is deemed unclean. Jesus shows compassion for the man and touches him. Now, we live in a time where there is such a thing as good touch and bad touch, right? We know about bad touch. Bad touch is a touch that brings hurt or harm to another person, or it causes us to feel uncomfortable. And we need to speak up against that. And if we can't speak for ourselves, we need to find an advocate who will. I am not in any way an advocate for reducing the importance of understanding what is bad touch. But I think sometimes the overreaction is that then we avoid good touch, is what Jesus did for this man. I want to cite a few examples of good touch. I was in one of our nursing homes recently, and there was one there who had a dirty bib on. She'd been eating, she was sitting in the wheelchair, she'd eaten her lunch, and it was filled with food. Her hands were kind of crusted with food, and she still had a little food around her mouth, and I stopped to talk with her. I got down onto my knees, and as I looked into her eyes, she looked lost. She looked distant. But as soon as I touched her hand, she brought my hand up to her cheek and held it there. And I continued to talk with her, and then tears began to form in the corner of her eyes. And I saw a flicker of light within. So many of our seniors get forgotten in our society. So many of our seniors are touched, yes, to get them clean. They're touched to get dressed. They are touched to get their hair combed and set for the day. But many are forgotten by family and friends. And sometimes we look at people, we say, good touch, bad touch, no touch. And we fail to reach out. And we as human beings are so hungry for touch. We are so hungry to be touched and to know that we're cared for. And so that would be one example. A second example might be continuing to offer help to people who are struggling and putting their groceries, for instance, in their car, loading something up, a solo person trying to put that in. And I get that probably 8 out of 10 times that I might offer, do you need some help? Because of stranger danger, they'll say, no, thank you. But you know what? Sometimes there are people who honestly need help. And isn't it worth it to accept a few no's to have the opportunity to help those who truly need help? Or thirdly, sitting and waiting, which sometimes we end up doing in life. Sitting and waiting in a doctor's office, sitting and waiting at a Walgreens, and just saying to the person sitting next to you, if you sense any kind of openness, how you doing? Some kind of engagement. Again, some of the time you may get little or no response, but sometimes it leads to some pretty amazing, hungry conversation. People hungry to have somebody listen to them. This is what I think lies within this example of Jesus touching the leper. Jesus did not need to touch this man. Many of his healing stories, he just speaks the word and they're healed. But he knew that this person had been alienated and isolated for a long time. That's what happens with leprosy in biblical times. They had to leave the community. They had to leave their family. They had to go and find a place all alone. And what a lonely place to suffer in the midst of your illness. And Jesus comes along and sees the need and touches him. Thirdly, there's the story of reintegration. Finally, Jesus says to the man, now go show yourself to the priest. This is appropriate. This is how they get reintegrated into society. And on the way, the man begins to tell others about him. So what do we say about reintegration? Perhaps it is a neighbor who comes out of prison or out of jail. Maybe it's a neighbor who moves back into our community, who moved away and now has moved back in. May have moved somewhere else and now is here. Could be a family member who has brought some hurt or some harm in the family and has been distant and now seeks to come back in. How do we respond? Reintegration begins by offering kind eyes and a warm smile. You know, when we see people who, quote unquote, our brain says, oh, this is somebody different than me, oftentimes we crank our head and we give that look of, words or actions speaking much louder than words, the body language. Jesus showed kind eyes, I'm sure, to this man who knelt before him because he had confidence to bring his request to Jesus. I know you can make me clean if you so choose. Secondly, when forgiving yet not forgetting means an honest new beginning. When forgiving yet not forgetting means an honest new beginning. This is especially true within families where there may be some brokenness experienced. And somebody wants to try to come back in. What holds people away is our unwillingness to forgive. And I'm speaking to those of you who have probably been hurt by someone else in your family or a friend or somebody at the church. Forgiving is a hard thing. It's hard to forgive others at times. Sometimes it's even harder to forgive ourselves. But forgiving is the gift of Christ. It's the gift of this meal that we will eat and drink and celebrate. It's about the forgiveness of God who welcomes us back time and again and reminds us of his love, reminds us of his forgiveness, which means to make the relationship right. You see, but I didn't say anything about forgetting what the wrong is. Because we can't do that. God has given us a memory. But we're able to move forward as we process the forgiveness and extend it to another and maybe even ourselves, which enables a new beginning. And finally, it takes an insider to welcome somebody on the outside to come back in. Family member, former coworker, neighbor, church person. What are you doing here? It's not Easter. Boy, it's been a long time since you've darkened these doors. Boy, that feels warm and affirming. Maybe I'm excited that you're here today. How you doing? It's all in the ways in which we communicate. Finally, friends, we do believe as followers of Jesus that Jesus came to initiate a movement to change the world. To change the world one person at a time. That love overcomes hate, that kindness overcomes evil, and that goodness overcomes all that is hurtful in our world. So this man, who is now healed, cleansed, went and could not stop telling people about what Jesus had done for him. I believe that those who experience God's amazing grace within cannot stop but want to tell others about what Jesus has done. He experienced inclusion. He experienced love. He experienced forgiveness. I ask you today, what have you experienced from Jesus? What has Jesus done in your life? And now may we, like the man who is now clean, go out with open arms and open minds and reach out to people on the margins, people who are hurting, people who are lonely, people who have no one else to care for them. May God send us to those and invite them to come and worship, to come and experience God's amazing grace. This is how our world has changed for good and for God, friends. It's a God thing. It's what God does inside. That's what this story about the man who is cleansed of his leprosy is all about. The amazing love of Jesus Christ. That's the good news. May you be bold and share the hope that lies within this week. And I'll be eager to see who you bring with you next week. Amen.
let us together